In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was already crumbling. Even with Germany in free fall, many SS units continued fighting as if retreating were impossible. The internal cohesion, built over years of operations and shared trenches, worked like glue. It kept the men together even when the front was falling apart on all sides. This applied to both the Germans and the foreign volunteers integrated into the Waffen-SS. For many, the calculation was brutal and simple. They had no after to return to. Going home meant exposing themselves to reprisals, trials, or revenge, and falling into the hands of the Red Army was seen as an almost inevitable sentence. But by mid-1945, that stubbornness no longer held up in military reality. Yes, they still had good technology on certain fronts, effective weaponry, tactical experience, and in some cases a level of training superior to many improvised units of the Reich. It is also true that in terms of combativeness, the Waffen-SS often ranked among the toughest troops in Germany. The problem was that none of that compensated for the essential. They were worn out, outnumbered, short of fuel, with broken supply lines and under constant pressure from multiple fronts. They could be fearsome in isolated clashes, but the engine could no longer run. Many Waffen-SS soldiers returned home on foot. By then, the train no longer worked. The tracks had been destroyed, the roads were broken, and the bridges had been bombed, so sometimes they had to cross rivers by swimming. With almost no carts or transport available, many walked back from Belgium, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. They only wanted to find their families alive in the countryside, because the cities had been reduced to ruins by Allied bombing. And yet, many did not make it. Several were killed without warning because the SS had a reputation for not surrendering and not taking prisoners. But there is an important nuance. These hot executions are poorly documented, and there was no widespread massacre of all SS men simply for belonging to the organization. After the war, what did happen was something else. The SS was declared a criminal organization, but that did not automatically make every member a war criminal. In the strict sense, a war criminal was someone who ordered atrocities or committed them directly. That is why governments could not execute someone just for being in the SS. They had to try and convict them for specific crimes. Many were indeed prosecuted and executed for participating in crimes such as murder, extermination camps, slave labor, or the execution of prisoners, but not all members were directly involved. What many people did not understand at the time was that the SS had not been just elite troops. Within Germany, they had operated as a parallel power with their own control apparatus. They directed police forces, maintained entire military formations, and in addition, built an economic empire that extended across the Reich and the occupied territories. They did not limit themselves to administration. They opened and absorbed companies on a large scale, taking over existing businesses with their facilities and often with their full staff. In the occupied areas of the East, entire sectors came under their operational control. And here arose the dilemma that almost no one wanted to name. In those factories and workshops were workers who had not chosen to serve the SS. They simply stayed at their posts because the alternative was punishment, hunger, or something worse. On paper, however, they were recorded as employees of a structure that the world was beginning to see as criminal. What was to be done with these people when the Reich collapsed? Could they be executed just for being trapped within the machinery? The same applied to the army of administrative and support personnel that had sustained an organization of that size. Secretaries, clerks, accountants, drivers, maintenance workers, facility guards. Many of them had not fired a weapon at prisoners nor participated in torture, but they were listed as part of the institution. In the post-war period, that detail could become a social sentence and even a physical risk, even if there was no direct proof of atrocities committed by these people. That is why, when punishment was discussed, the legal distinction became crucial. Punishing an entire group simply for belonging to an organization without distinguishing individual behavior was considered collective punishment, and that was prohibited under the rules of war. The line separating revenge from justice was initially maintained. Not everyone in uniform was a war criminal, but rather those who had ordered crimes or directly carried them out. At that point, the question was no longer who was in the SS, but what exactly did this person do? The reality is that the situation was extremely complex. In the immediate post-war chaos with archives destroyed, often deliberately, it was not clear who had committed which crimes or where. The SS had been a massive organization composed both of committed Nazis and tens of thousands of conscripts, civilian employees, and auxiliary personnel. In that context, a mass execution was not a viable option. The only possible path was to investigate case by case, identify individual responsibilities, and separate the direct perpetrators from the rest. This process inevitably took time, and that time worked in favor of many. While trying to bring order to the administrative and judicial chaos, tens of thousands of former SS members managed to escape. Some eventually entered the United States as refugees, but an even larger number fled to South America, particularly to countries like Argentina. It was precisely in this window of disorder and slowness that many of the true war criminals managed to disappear. This is one of the main reasons why so many responsible individuals were never prosecuted. When the victorious powers finally managed to separate the guilty from the general mass, many were already gone. The result was frustrating and morally bitter, but the alternative would have been even worse: the summary execution of around 800,000 people. Modern estimates place the actual number of SS war criminals at about 70,000. That would have meant killing approximately 11 innocent people for every real culprit. No matter how strong the desire was to see those responsible for the horrors punished, that price was unacceptable. Between imperfect justice and indiscriminate revenge, the world chose, at least in theory, the former, even knowing that many perpetrators would escape forever. Given this reality, the idea of mass executing all SS members posed enormous problems, both moral and practical. It would have involved killing people who had been conscripted against their will, soldiers who had first served in the regular army and were transferred due to mere administrative changes, and even citizens of neutral countries such as Sweden or Spain. All of this occurred while the victorious powers were simultaneously trying to maintain good relations with those same states and prevent them from falling under Soviet influence. All of this also directly clashed with the Allies' plans for Germany. After World War II, one of the central objectives was to put an end to European aggression and the cycle of revenge between states. It is worth recalling a key fact. In 1945, the total membership of organizations linked to the SS exceeded 1 million. Executing a human mass of that size would have generated deep and lasting resentment against the occupying power, whether it was the United States in the West or the Soviet Union in the East. Far from disarming extremism, such a policy would have fueled hatred, pushing part of the German population toward anti-Western positions, into the Soviet sphere of influence, or even toward new neo-Nazi movements. In that context, the creation of a Western-aligned German state would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible. No German leader could have maintained legitimacy while relying on a power responsible for the mass executions of prisoners of war. Moreover, such a measure would have delayed, rather than accelerated, the disappearance of Nazi sympathy and revanchism. Germany would have become an unstable, resentful, and costly ally, right on the direct border with the enemy bloc. From a strategic point of view, it was the worst possible scenario. Adding to this was a very concrete problem: reconstruction. Germany was already suffering from a severe labor shortage, to the point that much of the cleaning and rubble removal work fell on women, the so-called Trümmerfrauen. Men returning from the front were needed in all sectors: industry, agriculture, administration, infrastructure. Eliminating hundreds of thousands would have worsened the labor deficit, multiplied the number of families without support, reduced the tax base, and left the country with fewer political cadres and less military potential in the face of a possible confrontation with the communist bloc. The country's international image was also at stake. The United States in particular wanted to present itself as a liberator and as the leader of the so-called free world. Participating in a mass execution of prisoners of war, possibly the largest in history, would have destroyed that narrative. It would have provoked distrust in neutral countries and fear in former Axis allies such as Italy or Japan, who might have wondered whether their own soldiers would be next. There was even a secondary, but real factor: the practical usefulness of these men. Some SS veterans were employed by other countries in subsequent conflicts. France, for example, used former German combatants in Indochina, and others ended up as mercenaries in Central Africa serving European companies. And finally, there was the economic issue. The war had left many countries in debt and exhausted. Executing prisoners not only brought no tangible benefit, but also represented an enormous cost in resources, time, and ammunition. From a cold and pragmatic logic, there was nothing to gain and too much to lose. After the collapse of the Reich, very few SS leaders ended up sharing the same fate as Heinrich Himmler. There were suicides, yes, but they were the exception, not the rule. Odilo Globoknik, one of the most involved figures in the extermination machinery, fell to cyanide. SS physician Ernst Robert Grawitz chose an even more brutal exit. He killed himself and took his family with him using grenades. Leonardo Conti, already in custody, was also removed, and other high-ranking officers like Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger and Hans-Georg Prutzmann ended everything in the final days, when the encirclement closed and the chances of escape disappeared. For the rest, the end was different. Allied tribunals and European courts located several central figures of the system and brought them to justice. Those executed included Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, high-ranking police and SS chiefs like Friedrich Jeckeln and Hans Albin Rauter, leaders of the central structure like Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Oswald Pohl and Kurt Daluege, direct commanders of extermination units such as Otto Ohlendorf, and some administrators of the regime in occupied territories like Arthur Greiser, Albert Forster, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart. It was a selective purge. Emblematic names were punished, especially those who could be clearly linked to mass crimes. But the overall picture was not one of total collapse. A considerable portion of the high command survived. Many were sentenced to long terms or forced labor, and yet, over the years, quite a few ended up receiving pardons, sentence reductions, or relatively short imprisonments. The post-war period did not close the case, it left it unfinished, and the most unsettling aspect was what happened to some of the darkest figures. Several managed to disappear amid false identities and escape networks. Adolf Eichmann was the most famous example. He evaded capture for years until he was located by Israeli agents in 1960 and executed in Jerusalem 2 years later. Other key names remained shrouded in shadows and rumors for decades: Alois Brunner, Dannecker, Rothke, Müller of the Gestapo himself, and Camp Inspector Glücks, among others. In many cases, closure never came. Only the list of the missing remained. The vast majority of SS men did not end up on the gallows or in a major trial. Their fate was captivity, and with it a form of downfall that no sentence, neither convicting nor absolving, could fully rectify. In the barracks and on the grounds of Allied prisoner camps, a debate arose that did not fade over the years. Between those who felt deceived and those who remained attached to the cause, between the nostalgic and the broken, between the ashamed and the stubborn. Guilt, or the need to deny it, became a daily presence. Many asked themselves the same question, with anger or fear. How had it been possible that young people full of enthusiasm ended up as conscienceless instruments? How had a distorted idea of loyalty and honor led them to act as automatic executors, morally surrendered to the will of the Führer? It was easy to take refuge in an alibi. Not everyone had killed, not everyone had been in a camp, and only a minority had participated directly in the most atrocious crimes. From that logic, they could reject collective guilt and hope to be exonerated. But there were those who were not satisfied with that minimal answer. They looked deeper and forced themselves to recognize that even without having pulled the trigger, there was something in that formation that predisposed one to abuse. Discipline turned into worship, obedience transformed into the supreme virtue, brutality disguised as duty. Reviewing what had happened, the history of the SS appeared as the chronicle of a lost generation, shaped by aggressive pessimism, by contempt for the bourgeois, and by the seduction of an order that promised belonging, adventure, masculine brotherhood, and destiny. They joined attracted by a double promise. On one hand, life within a military community that offered glory, security, and the shine of martial ritual. On the other, the illusion of being part of a closed, almost secret elite with access to real power. The Black Order fed this fantasy. Upon joining, many believed they were becoming both soldiers and masters, members of a chosen circle that not only served the state but upheld and controlled it from within. And when everything collapsed, that same illusion of belonging to something superior was what made it most difficult to accept the truth. Although there was no official massacre ordered by the states to systematically eliminate SS men, isolated and poorly documented executions did occur in the final months of the war. At the beginning of May 1945, a dozen Frenchmen from the Waffen-SS Charlemagne Division surrendered to the American soldiers without firing a single shot. Some had arrived from the Hirscher Regiment, like Obersturmführer Krotov. Others came directly from hospitals, still wearing a discharge slip pinned to their uniform that spoke for them. During that same period, Lieutenant Briffel, a veteran of the LVF, had not served in the Waffen-SS. He had withdrawn along with the PPF staff to the shores of Lake Constance. The Americans gathered them with German prisoners and interned them in Bad Reichenhall, inside the Mountain Hunters barracks, where the war seemed to have finally ended, at least for those behind the barbed wire. On May 6th, while General Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division continued its advance through Bavaria, the column entered the small town and took control. The captured French soon learned that the Guards were Gaullists, and this news sounded like a preordained sentence to them. They then decided to escape. One night they managed to get past the barracks fence and ran toward a nearby grove, hoping the trees would swallow their shadows. But their escape was discovered almost immediately. 2 companies of the 2nd Armoured surrounded them, forced them back, and put them under supervision, leaving no room for another attempt. For a long time it was repeated that Leclerc had not seen them, but photographs by a war correspondent told another story. The general appeared and spoke to them face to face. He reproached them for wearing German uniforms, and they, in a reply that sounded insolent, said that he was wearing an American uniform. That response ignited the decision. Leclerc resolved to execute the 12. There was no trial, no military tribunal, not even an improvised one. Everything was arranged so that no witnesses remained, and the only thing granted was the assistance of the chaplain, as if that last spiritual hand were the only thing that could still be saved from an already written end. On May 8th, when Germany had already surrendered and the fighting had ceased, they were loaded onto a truck and taken to Karlstein, more precisely to a place called Kugelbach, in the late afternoon. There they were told they would be shot in the back. The prisoners protested and requested the right to die facing the firing squad. Father Maxim Gaume, a missionary in Dahomey and chaplain of the division, was present and left a testimony that later reached the families and was published in a special edition of the magazine Historia. He recounted that the young lieutenant who was supposed to command the squad did not belong to the unit and was disturbed by the order, even wondering whether he should disobey. Yet it was carried out. The condemned received religious assistance. 1 refused it. 3 said they had no message for their family. They were shot in groups of 4 so that the last saw the first fall. None allowed their eyes to be blindfolded, and according to the chaplain, they fell shouting, "Long live France." Afterwards, by order received, the bodies were left lying in the same place. 3 days later, an American patrol buried them. Then wooden crosses with names were placed, which later disappeared, as if someone wanted to erase the traces. The inhabitants of a nearby farm remembered what had happened, although they never gave a precise account. They understood what was going on while preparations were underway and hid so as not to witness something that could have consequences. Years later, on December 6, 1948, a judicial investigation was opened at the request of relatives, but it did not clarify the capture, the behavior of the victims, or the exact circumstances of the death. Finally, on June 2, 1949, the bodies were exhumed from the Karlstein clearing and transferred to the St. Zeno Communal Cemetery in Bad Reichenhall, where a common grave remained in Group 11, Row 3, numbers 81 and 82. And there, with an exact location and a story difficult to tell, the visible trace of those 12 men ended. When the Western Allies began repeatedly encountering Waffen-SS units in 1944 and 1945, the capture of prisoners ceased to be a mechanical procedure and became a situation loaded with tension. In theory, the rules were clear. An enemy who surrendered, unarmed and under control, was to be treated as a prisoner of war. In practice, the front did not always resemble the theory, and with the SS, the problem was double. On one hand, there was the reputation for brutality, and on the other, the perception that these men, even if surrendered, could still be a threat or a symbol of everything that was being attempted to destroy. On the Western Front, the psychological breaking point was the Ardennes offensive and especially the news from Malmedy. From that point on, in some Allied units, a dangerous idea began to take hold. You don't negotiate with the SS. You don't take them. It's not worth the risk. It was not a written and uniform order, but an atmosphere transmitted as a rumor or as a comment among veterans. In a war of forests, snow, and ambushes, where the enemy could appear suddenly a few meters away, such a rumor did not hang in the air. It altered the reaction of the finger on the trigger. In that climate, there were episodes in which German prisoners, including Waffen-SS members, were killed shortly after surrendering. Sometimes this happened immediately after combat, with nerves still on edge, when a soldier saw a friend fall and felt that the culprit was standing in front of him, hands raised. Other times it occurred through a colder logic, a lack of men to guard the prisoners, rapid advancement, fear of a counter-ambush, or the belief that those prisoners could escape and fight again. And in other cases, the motivation was openly moral. They did the same thing. They don't deserve it. The phrase refusal to take prisoners did not always mean a direct execution. Many times it manifested in a grayer form, surrenders that were not accepted, prisoners who were shot because they tried to escape, wounded, ignored, disarmed groups that disappeared into the chaos without formal record. War produces witnessless zones, and these are precisely where discipline is tested. When there are no cameras, no reports, and the front keeps moving, the temptation to erase the act is enormous. However, there was also the other side, Allied officers who insisted on complying with the laws of war and restrained reprisals. There were formal reminders, inspections, and in some armies investigations into abuses were opened. The pressure to maintain discipline was real. The problem was that this pressure competed with something stronger, the immediate experience of the front. An international convention weighs less than the memory of a fallen comrade or the fear of being executed if captured. The difference between civilization and barbarism in those days could be reduced to an officer present who imposed order, or the absence of that officer for 5 minutes. To that tension, a key factor was added. The Allies did not regard the Waffen-SS as a neutral enemy. The SS, as an organization, was associated with the political core of Nazism, with repression and terror. Even if the soldier in front of you was a late recruit, the uniform placed him within a historical machinery. And here appears the most dangerous mechanism, collective guilt. The prisoner ceases to be an individual and becomes the symbol of a system. When this happens, capture is no longer just a military act and becomes an instant judgment made with emotions. That is why, in the last months of the war, Waffen-SS soldiers began to fear something additional, that surrender would not save them, and that fear also had practical effects. Many tried to hide their affiliation, tearing off insignias, blending in with Wehrmacht prisoners, lying about their unit. The Allies knew this and responded with increasingly strict filters. There were screening processes to separate SS members, especially when large groups were captured. They looked for signs on the uniform, documentation, cross-checked testimonies, and also known physical marks such as blood-type tattoos, which in certain SS sectors were used for medical identification. This search fueled paranoia. If some SS members were hiding, then anyone could be SS, and if anyone could be SS, then fear extended beyond the real enemy. As territories were liberated and direct evidence of crimes was increasingly discovered, such as concentration camps, mass graves, and devastated villages, the tension rose even more. For an Allied soldier entering a place where horror was visible for the first time, the impulse for retaliation could be immediate. There were cases where guards or SS unit members captured in this context were killed on the spot or shortly afterward as an outlet for anger. It is not hard to understand the emotion. The hard part is accepting the moral leap. If the victor executes prisoners even for justice, they are crossing the same boundary that condemns the defeated. Now, while in the West, the phenomenon existed irregularly and under formal discipline that often suppressed it, in the East, the story was even more brutal. The war between Germany and the Soviet Union had been a war of extermination and mutual reprisals. In that scenario, SS members faced enormous risk if captured. The Red Army and Soviet security organs tended to treat the SS as part of a criminal apparatus of the regime, and the likelihood of executions, mistreatment, or death in captivity was much higher. This, in turn, reinforced the never-surrender fanaticism in many German units when the enemy was Soviet, and fueled a cycle of violence in which capture became for some a foregone sentence. So what did the Allies do with Waffen-SS soldiers? The real answer is not a single one. The institutional response was to capture them, interrogate them, classify them, and send them to prisoner of war camps, and then, in certain cases, put those responsible for crimes on trial. That was the official line, and most cases followed that path. At the same time, however, there existed an informal and dark response in certain sectors of the front. The idea that capturing SS members was not worth it, and that it was preferable to eliminate them to avoid risks out of anger or revenge. This response was neither universal nor constant, but it was real enough to be preserved in testimonies, silences, and the uncomfortable memory of a war that, even on the winning side, had shadows. Beyond the four-nation process of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, the occupying forces, including the United States, also conducted individual military tribunals in their respective zones. The trials presided over by the United States Army took place in Dachau from November 1945 to December 1947. The accused included a wide range of individuals, from high-ranking German military officers, Nazi officials, concentration camp personnel, and also civilians. They were charged with war crimes against Allied prisoners of war and crimes committed against civilians and Allied prisoners of war in concentration camps, including Dachau. One component of the Dachau trials, the Malmedy massacre trial, took place over 2 months, from May to July 1946, and focused on the crimes of the Waffen-SS against American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians. The Malmedy massacre was a documented and publicized killing of unarmed American prisoners of war by the 1st SS during the Battle of the Ardennes. On December 17, 1944, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, commanded by Joachim Peiper, captured 113 American soldiers, gathered them in a field and machine-gunned them. Some survived by being buried under their comrades or feigning death, but 84 American prisoners of war were killed.